Already, we'll get to the latest in Minneapolis, where the state government of Minnesota seems to be threatening the federal government under Tim Walz. Astonishing stuff. The rhetoric of the left with regard to ICE keeps ratcheting up. And the latest in Iran. Plus, we're joined by the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright. Big show for you today. For decades, Americans have been taught a version of history designed to shame them, silence them, make certain questions off limits. Well, that ends right now. Matt Walsh's new series, Real History with Matt Walsh, premieres Monday, January 19th, exclusively on Daily Wire Plus. This series confronts the lies, omissions, and propaganda baked into the history you were told not to challenge. And it starts with one of the biggest myths of all. Here's your first look at episode 1.
I thought I knew the story of slavery, who the villains were, who the victims were. And I realized almost everything I'd been told was a lie. Why do they always avoid the inconvenient fact that Africans sold the slaves to Europeans? What were those African kingdoms like? In what grade will we learn about the millions of white Europeans dragged off in chains by North African pirates while the world looked away? When's the lecture on black slaveholders in the South? It's time for the truth. The history they don't teach in public schools. It's Real History with Matt Walsh.
Don't miss it. Season 1 of Real History with Matt Walsh premieres Monday, January 19th. Join now at dailywireplus.com. So the situation in Minnesota continues to roil. We are looking at the very real possibility of a standoff between the state government led by Tim Walz, the former vice presidential candidate under Kamala Harris and current governor, who just had to step away from a third-term run in Minnesota because of all of the allegations of fraud with which he was caught up. A standoff between that government and the federal government. That is something now being pushed very hard by Tim Walz, even as new details emerge as to who is behind the Minneapolis ICE resistance movement, and new details emerge about Renee Good, who is the woman who was shot and killed by an ICE officer, well, apparently in the process of either attempting to escape ICE or to possibly run down an officer who was essentially on the front left bumper of her vehicle. According to the New York Post, Renee Good, the mom who was killed by a federal agent after veering her car toward him, was an anti-ICE warrior and was part of a group of activists who worked to document and resist the federal immigration crackdown in Minnesota, according to the New York Post. Now, of course, obstruction of the law enforcement community in its pursuit of the enforcement of law is in and of itself a crime. Good moved to the city last year, linked up with the anti-ICE activists through her 6-year-old son's woke charter school, which boasts that it puts social justice first and prioritizes, quote, involving kids in political and social activism. So, I mean, number one, if you decide that you need to give up your life in pursuit of mildly hindering ICE in finding illegal immigrants from Somalia and deporting them, and you have a child at home, these are bad life decisions. Truly. A mother named Lisa, whose child attends the same school, said she was a warrior. She died doing what was right. I know she was doing the right thing. I watched the video plenty of times, but I also know in my heart, the woman she was doing everything right. Well, again, I think it's very difficult to make the case that she was doing everything right when this happened. At the very least, resisting law enforcement is a foolish move. And again, this seems to me more like a tragedy than like a quote-unquote act of terror by the woman who was driving the car, by Renee Good. With that said, when you resist the police and when you create a situation in which the officer has a reasonable perception that you are trying to run him down with your motor vehicle, you getting shot is a predictable outcome of this thing. Good and her wife, Rebecca, 40, were raising the boy together in the mostly working-class, activist-heavy neighborhood of South Minneapolis, which features tree-lined streets and a large number of homes with windows decked out in LGBTQ plus minus divided by sign flags or signs depicting George Floyd. Just as many others did in the lefty enclave, Good sends her son to a place called Southside Family Charter School, according to the New York Post. That is a K-5 academy opened in 1972 that from its inception has been unabashedly dedicated to social justice education, according to the co-founder, a person named Susie Oppenheim. So she became involved in something called ICE Watch, which is a loose coalition of activists dedicated to disrupting ICE operations in the city. Apparently, current event topics like the killing of George Floyd were regular parts of the curriculum. Last month, students took a field trip where they learned about Aboriginal issues, a reference to the indigenous people of faraway Australia. So apparently she was trained, quote, against these ICE agents, what to do, what not to do. It's a very thorough training. ICE Watch and adjacent groups can also turn confrontational, with numerous instances of activists ramming agents with their cars in the past. So yes, this person was, in fact, a radical activist. And she was a stay-at-home mother of 3 who dabbled in poetry. And this is being portrayed by the media as having very little to do with activism, but apparently it has an awful lot to do with activism. The New York Post also has a report today on who is behind the Minneapolis ICE resistance movement. According to the New York Post, radical leftist groups, including one financed with $7.8 million from, wait for it, progressive billionaire George Soros, are behind the anti-ICE protests in Minnesota, indivisible Twin Cities, which describes itself as a grassroots group of volunteers, has led many of the protests against ICE raids in Minnesota. And that is an offshoot of something called the Indivisible Project in Washington, D.C., which is a movement to defeat the Trump agenda, according to the Open Society Foundation, which granted it something close to $8 million. That group was also behind the recent protests in favor of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela and the No Kings demonstrations against the Trump administration throughout the country last year. Again, there seems to be some contradiction between No Kings and also, yes, Venezuelan dictators. Other protest leaders include, wait for it, the Council on American Islamic Relations, an anti-Israel group whose Minnesota chapter's executive director, Jaylani Hussein, has railed against ICE at protests. And the coalition of people who believe that Western civilization must be torn out by its roots is quite strong. It continues to march. The scavengers that I talk about in my book, they are quite real. And that coalition is well-funded. Well, as all of this happens, the FBI is making the point that this is a federal issue, that because the ICE officer involved was a federal officer, federal law enforcement preempts state law enforcement issues. And so, according to the Wall Street Journal, Minnesota law enforcement officials said on Thursday the FBI blocked them from participating in an investigation into the fatal shooting of a woman by an ICE agent, intensifying the dispute between the state and federal government over the death. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz denounced the FBI, saying any probe that doesn't include state law enforcement cannot be trusted. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the opposite is also true. Any probe that includes a state law enforcement apparatus run by Tim Walz, who has already effectively declared this a murder, is not going to be a relevant or useful piece of law enforcement. That any investigative body answerable to Tim Walz, who presided over the burning down of his own major city, Minneapolis, in 2020, over what I believe to be a fraudulent take on the George Floyd death, I don't really trust Tim Walz on that very much. Walz has obviously been upping the ante. He continues over and over and over to use extraordinary language with regard to ICE. Yesterday, he announced that he would be staging the Minnesota National Guard. He put out a press statement, quote, Governor Tim Walz has authorized the Minnesota National Guard to be staged and ready to support local and state law enforcement in protecting critical infrastructure and maintaining public safety following a shooting involving federal immigration enforcement agents in South Minneapolis. Now, will the National Guard be protecting infrastructure from rioters, or are they there to obstruct ICE in their performance of their federal duties? That's a question because of the way that Walz is talking. Of course, the latter would be a crime. Walz said, quote, Minnesotans have met the moment. Thousands of people have peacefully made their voices heard. Minnesota, thank you. We saw powerful peace. We have every reason to believe that the peace will hold. Yesterday, I directed the National Guard to be ready should all of this be needed. By the way, Minnesota actually canceled classes. They actually canceled school in Minneapolis because of this, which is fairly incredible that a controversial shooting involving an activist who appears to have been aiming her car at an ICE agent, at the very least clipped the ICE agent before being shot, that results in kids being released from school. Why? Because they're so afraid of riots and that's going to take over the schools? If so, what does that say about Tim Walz's governance in the city? By the way, worth noting, the ICE agent who was involved in this shooting had apparently previously been rammed by a car. That is according to Daily Wire. The officer himself, apparently, was transported to a nearby hospital, was later released. Kristi Noem said that the agent involved had already been rammed by a car in a previous encounter, pointing out that ICE alone is facing a 1,300% increase in assaults against them and an 8,000% increase in death threats against ICE agents. In fact, DHS put out an entire list with evidence of the various attacks and assaults that have been performed on ICE agents. Earlier this year, a Tren de Aragua suspect rammed law enforcement a vehicle into a tree. There are 2 separate vehicular assaults in Chicago. I mean, the pictures are evident. They're put out by Department of Homeland Security. An ICE officer was hit with a car, nearly crushing him. If you go back to September of last year, a sniper, as you'll recall, attacked an ICE facility in Dallas. So something quite dangerous is happening. When you create a permission structure that suggests that ICE is the problem, when you create that permission structure and you say that they are the Gestapo, that they are evil, that they are Nazis, then it shouldn't be a gigantic surprise when people start treating them as such and violence increases. Now, in the midst of all of this, the agent who is involved is actually unmasked online. You want to know why ICE agents are masked? The reason is because their lives come under threat thanks to actions like this. So the ICE agent apparently was unmasked, which puts his life at risk for sure. Get to more on this in a moment. First, it's tough to relax. For me, like as a general rule, I get in bed at night. I really need to just let things go. I need to relax. And what I have found is that the only thing that makes that happen is Helix Sleep, because I have to have the mattress that is right for me. Finding the right mattress doesn't have to be complicated. Our sponsor Helix makes it incredibly straightforward with their sleep quiz. It matches you to the perfect mattress based on your specific preferences and sleep needs. They're not just another mattress company either. Helix is the most awarded mattress brand out there with glowing reviews from major publications like Forbes and Wired. Folks, not just marketing hype. A study they conducted found 82% of participants actually saw an increase in their deep sleep cycle while sleeping on a Helix Sleep mattress, which is pretty impressive when you think about how crucial quality sleep is for everything else in life. Again, I've got that firm but breathable mattress. That means that my back doesn't ache when I wake up, and because it's breathable, I don't heat up at night. They even offer free shipping straight to your door, a 120-night sleep trial so you can actually test it out in your own home. They back up everything with a limited lifetime warranty. Start sleeping right tonight by ordering a Helix mattress today. Head on over to helixsleep.com/Ben for 27% off site-wide. That's helixsleep.com/Ben for 27% off site-wide. Make sure you enter our show name after checkout so they know we sent you. helixsleep.com/Ben. And the Democrats just cannot stop upping the ante. So yesterday, Tim Walz, again, the governor of Minnesota, who right now is in a world of hurt politically because of that Somali fraud. Remember, this ICE activity was initiated based on reports of not only Somali fraud, but illegal immigrants from Somalia engaged in fraud. Tim Walz compared this moment to the Civil War. It's now the Civil War. If you send ICE to enforce arrest warrants against criminals in the country, Tim Walz says it's now a civil war.
When things looked really bleak, it was Minnesota's first that held that line for the nation on that July 3rd, 1863. And I think now we may be in that moment that the nation's looking to us to hold the line on democracy, to hold the line on decency, to hold the line on accountability, and more than that, to rise up as neighbors and simply say, we can look out for one another. We can have differences. But we've proved to the world going on 250 years that our democracy could hold. It feels to me like we're at one of those inflection points.
It's an inflection, like a Civil War inflection point. Now, one of the things that I've said many, many times is that when you have high-level politicians talking this way about the country, it is very bad for the country, truly bad. When you say we are at the point where we are at blows with them, we are going to go to war with one another. It's a civil war that's about to break out. It's the end of the country. These sorts of things from political leaders turn into self-perpetuating prophecies. They turn into self-fulfilling prophecies because the more people believe that they can't get along with their neighbors and that there is no basis for a common Americanism, the more they are likely to see each other as enemies and not just sometimes political opponents. Yesterday, Tim Walz called for a moment of silence, which is to take place today. And of course, used some pretty charged language.
In Minnesota, I'm declaring tomorrow at 10 a.m. on January 9th, I'd ask everyone to pause for a moment of silence, to remember Renee Good, also to remember all that's good and right about this nation. And I'm going to ask folks if they can, I'd ask employers to give their people some space. I'd ask each and every one to find a way to contribute in your community. It might be shoveling your neighbor's walk. It might be being at a food bank. It might be pausing to talk to someone you haven't talked to before, but to show the goodness, to rise up, to make sure that we're being very, very clear about this, that we expect our constitutional rights to be respected, that law enforcement is local, that we expect accountability of our elected leaders, and that we are not going to go quietly And we're not going to give up on those things that matter so much to us. And chief amongst those is human dignity, respect, rule of law, all of the things that we know make this country great.
I mean, this sort of bizarre Orwellian language that Tim Walz is using right there. He moves very quickly from, we should take this moment of silence to go work at a food bank or talk to someone you've never talked to before. From there to, we need to respect rule of law, while overtly holding a moment of silence for a person who at the very least was involved in obstruction of the performance of law. When he says that law enforcement must be local, what he means is that federal law enforcement shouldn't do its job. And when he says that we should rise up, which is language that he uses right there in that video, when he says that we have an obligation to stand up for our constitutional rights, you do not have a constitutional right to be in this country illegally, nor do you have a constitutional right to thwart federal law enforcement in its pursuit of criminal illegal immigrants and their deportation. You do not have a right to do any of those things. All of this is part and parcel, of course, of Tim Walz's broader agenda, which is to label ICE Gestapo, which is what he did last year. Here he was in May of 2025, the governor of Minnesota.
Donald Trump's modern-day Gestapo is scooping folks up off the streets. They're in unmarked vans, wearing masks, being shipped off to foreign torture dungeons. No chance to mount a defense, not even a chance to kiss a loved one goodbye, just grabbed up by masked agents, shoved into those vans, and disappeared. To be clear, there's no way for us to know whether they were actually criminals or not, because they refused to give them a trial. We're supposed to just take their word for
it. Again, that was him in 2025, comparing ICE to the Gestapo. And then you wonder why people are out there confronting ICE. And when you put people in a moral position where they feel they must confront federal law enforcement and do it over and over and over again, basic rule, the more people are confronting law enforcement, the more there will be bad situations that emerge from those confrontations. This is just the way the world works. And again, listening to Tim Walz talk about morality is kind of astonishing, considering that just last year, he was saying that China might be the global moral authority, a true authoritarian state.
Who holds the moral authority? Who holds the ability to do that? Because we are not seen as a neutral actor. And we maybe never were. I don't want to tell anybody that. I think there's a lot of people who say you always leaned one way in this. But I think there was at least an attempt to be somewhat of the arbitrator in this. We saw President Carter do it with Begin and Sadat. We've had certain wins along the way that were actually mutually beneficial both ways. Now I ask who that is. And I mean, consistently over and over again, we're going to have to face the reality. It might be the Chinese.
I mean, unbelievable. Unbelievable. So that person is the person who's now the moral authority talking about authoritarianism. And remember, he presided over the riots in 2020 that shut down not only the city, but a large part of the country because he was unable to handle basic law enforcement function in his state. Meanwhile, the mayor of Minneapolis, who's been similarly outrageous, he told ICE to get the F out of here, which, of course, as the mayor of a city, you do not have the law enforcement power to do. And then he suggested that Renee Good had been murdered, which, again, even if you wanted to take the pro-Renee Good side of this equation, the claim that it wasn't at least disputed is insane. And you can watch that tape and you can come away with varying interpretations. The point I made yesterday is that it is not about the intent of Renee Good when she is driving the car, whether or not the officer is prosecuted. It is about the intent of the officer and his reasonable perception that there is a deadly threat to his life. And again, all of that presumably will be investigated. There will be investigations held into where the shots were fired from. Were they fired from the front of the car? Were they fired from the side of the car? Which matters because presumably if you fire from the front of the car while you are theoretically being run over, maybe there's an imminent danger of deadly threat. If you're now to the side of the car, does the same rule now apply? Right? But calling it a plain case of murder is nuts. But this is the Minneapolis mayor. And we should remember that this is part and parcel of a generalized dislike for law enforcement, period. This is the same guy who is doing the ridiculous prostrating himself before the woke gods over George Floyd. Here he was back in 2020 at a struggle session, the Minneapolis mayor.
You have to take responsibility here. I've been coming to grips with my own brokenness in this situation, my own failures, my own shortcomings, and I know there needs to be deep-seated structural reform in terms of how the department operates. The systemically racist system needs to be revamped.
That's who this pathetic person is. Truly pathetic. Well, he has a piece in the New York Times today calling the Trump administration liars. Quote, "The actions of the ICE agents deployed to my city are dangerous and now even deadly. But that danger has been compounded by the administration's claim that the victim committed an act of domestic terrorism. The Trump administration's false narrative about this week's shooting and the demonization of the victim are only part of a bigger lie." So again, I think that the categorization of the woman who was shot here, Renee Good, as a domestic terrorist, I don't see the evidence for that. I see evidence that she was violating federal law by impeding ICE in its pursuit of the law. And I think it's disputed as to whether she was trying to run over the person. Now you get to her intent. But what Jacob Fry says here is truly insane. Quote, "The Trump administration's false narrative about this week's shooting and the demonization of the victim are only part of a bigger lie. It wants the American public to believe that ICE's heavily militarized crackdown across this country is an effort to keep cities like Minneapolis safe. It is not. It is about vilifying not just immigrants, but all who welcome them and their contributions to our communities. By defending the lie about this clearly avoidable shooting in Minneapolis, the administration is sending a message to the entire country. If you show up for your immigrant neighbors, or even are simply present when those neighbors are taken, your rights will not be protected by the law and your life will be at risk." That is a lie. Renee Good was parked for 3 solid minutes by the tape at a 90-degree angle to impede ICE officials from doing their job. That is a violation of the law. But Jacob Fry is trying to ratchet up the tensions. Again, the idea is that essentially ICE are the foot soldiers of the Trumpian authoritarian regime. And if you keep saying that over and over, of course people are going to go out and target federal law enforcement. Unfortunately, it is not just Tim Walz who is doing this. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, apparently described the shooting of Renee Good as state-sponsored terrorism. On X, he wrote, "For almost a year, Donald Trump's personal police force has rampaged across America." Again, describing ICE as Trump's personal police force is totally crazy. I'm sorry, that's wild. That is a crazy statement. And it's obviously meant to draw comparisons to authoritarian leaders who have ramrod control of a Storm Abtalon, right? Their own SA to go and do their specific bidding. And that's nonsense. It's just nonsense. ICE has to abide by federal law. If they do not abide by federal law, then presumably they will be prosecuted. The governor of California wrote, "His administration has driven extremism and cruelty while discarding basic safeguards and accountability. Now a 37-year-old U.S. citizen is dead." Again, ignoring the circumstances of the death are key to this. I've said that I think that this is a confused and confusing situation. I don't think it's absolutely 100% clear-cut what Renee Good was trying to do. I do think that there is a very, very good case that the officer had a reasonable and objective fear for his life when he fired the shot that killed her, the shots that killed her. But ignoring that what she was doing, why she was there in the first place, makes it sound as though ICE broke down Renee Good's door and just shot her in her living room. And that is not what happened. On his press office X account, he added state-sponsored terrorism. State-sponsored terrorism? I mean, truly state-sponsored terrorism? Right? Terrorism is an attempt to effectuate a political end through violence. Okay, that is what terrorism is, definitionally. Through non-legal violence, not law enforcement. It is not state-sponsored terrorism if the cops even accidentally shoot someone. That is not state-sponsored terrorism. Or if they do so under disputed circumstances. State-sponsored terrorism would be that you initiate the law enforcement authorities to go do something broad-scale illegal. What is ICE doing that is broad-scale illegal, according to Gavin Newsom? State-sponsored because that makes every ICE agent a state-sponsored terrorist, does it not? Like, what exactly are we talking about here? What are we talking about here? This is crazy. And not only is it crazy, it's dangerous. It really is. Top-level politicians should not be talking like this. They should not. The notion that is now being promoted by apparently every major Democrat that ICE never should have been in Minneapolis in the first place in order to, again, effectuate federal law with regard to immigration is crazy. But this is what they're doing. Kathy Hochul in New York doing the same thing.
I've asked the ICE agent, why are you wearing the mask when I was down there at the 26 Federal Plaza? I said, why do you wear the mask? No other law enforcement does this. Our police don't do it. Our FBI agents don't do it. Why are you doing this? And they said, because we get doxxed, our family gets harassed, et cetera. I said, why do you think you are more than anybody else? I mean, come on, you're just trying to scare people. You're terrorizing people yourselves, and I don't want to see that. So we don't need that here. We're doing just fine in New York. The mayor and I will stand together and reject any efforts to try and militarize our streets, but they never should have been in Minneapolis in the first place.
Why should they never have been in Minneapolis in the first place? Why? Because they were effectuating the law? Why? I need an explanation. But again, this is all part and parcel of a broader left-wing argument that we are now living under a dictatorship, which of course is not even remotely true. Because if we were, Tim Walz would not be doing what he's doing. Neither would Kathy Hochul. Neither would Jacob Fry. Here's Joy Behar making the dumb person's case on all of this, as per our usual arrangement.
Just this last week, I'm just going to give you a summary of what we've been through. 1 week, Pete Hegseth started an illegal war for oil in Venezuela. Right. Stephen Miller threatened a military takeover of Greenland. RFK Jr. slashed childhood vaccine recommendations. And ICE shot and killed a United States citizen in Minneapolis. Yeah. That sort of adds up to me like a dictatorship in the making. That we are now in it. We are in it now.
So, a dictatorship in the making. Again, you keep saying this stuff. And then you wonder why people are ramming cars into ICE agents because you are telling them that they are a threat to your family. You are telling these people that ICE is a threat to Americans' families. Now, we've talked about permission structures for violence. We've talked about it over and over again on the show, particularly since the death of Charlie Kirk. We've talked about there are specific ideologies that lead to an increase in violence. Those ideologies posit that there is some sort of conspiratorial force out to get you, that there is specific danger to you and people like you, and that the only way to prevent that force from harming you is to preemptively harm them. And there are certain ideologies that are caught up in this. They threaten your identity, therefore they must be killed. That is why it took a person who is pro-trans radicalism apparently to shoot Charlie. Okay, well, the same thing is true here. If you keep saying over and over and over that ICE is not just a threat to illegal immigrants, which, of course, it is because that is their job, but that it is a threat to all Americans, that they are here to promote violence, that they are here to threaten you just for walking down the street, according to Jacob Fry. And that if you're on the very street where something is happening with ICE, you have to be afraid for your life. Why are you possibly wondering why people are trying to assassinate ICE officers? This is insane stuff. It really is terrible. And all Democrats have to do, all they have to do is suggest that the way that President Trump is going about enforcing federal immigration law is over the top, unspecific, and blunderbuss. Right? That's if I were going to try to steelman the Democratic position, a position with which I disagree, the case that I would be making is President Trump should be focusing in on true threats to the American people, meaning criminal illegal immigrants, until he gets rid of all the criminal illegal immigrants, deploying large-scale ICE raids to go and get people who are participating in welfare fraud should not be top priority. Yes, they should be deported, but that can be done in a less militant way or a less obvious way, and it's less effective if you actually show up en masse to do this sort of stuff. Now, you can make that case. You could. Now, I don't think it's a particularly strong case, but that is a case that you can make. You can make the case that the Trump administration has been too overt in its sort of propagandizing on behalf of the joys of deportations, refusing to acknowledge the pain of people, right? This is something that Democrats typically say about law enforcement. Okay, fine. You'd be wrong, but that's at least an argument. But making the case that ICE itself is a threat to the American way of life because they are doing their jobs is crazy and dangerous. Well, Kristi Noem over at the Department of Homeland Security, she made clear again that if people try to attack police officers or ICE officers, they will be prosecuted.
We are warning anyone, if you think you can harm an individual, a citizen of the United States, or a law enforcement officer, we will find you and bring you to justice. If you lay a finger on one of our officers, we will catch you, we will prosecute you, and you will feel the full extent of the law.
Okay, so again, that's what law enforcement should do, obviously. J.D. Vance, Vice President of the United States, has been taking a lead role in combating a lot of the rhetoric coming from the left over ICE. So yesterday, he said that the video is clear, and then he slammed the media for its coverage.
The way that the media, by and large, has reported this story has been an absolute disgrace, and it puts our law enforcement officers at risk every single day. What that headline leaves out is the fact that that very ICE officer nearly had his life ended, dragged by a car 6 months ago, 33 stitches in his leg. So you think maybe he's a little bit sensitive about somebody ramming him with an automobile? What that headline leaves out is that that woman was there to interfere with a legitimate law enforcement operation in the United States of America. What that headline leaves out is that that woman is part of a broader left-wing network to attack, to dox, to assault, and to make it impossible for our ICE officers to do their job. If the media wants to tell the truth, they ought to tell the truth that a group of left-wing radicals have been working tirelessly, sometimes using domestic terror techniques to try to make it impossible for the President of the United States to do what the American people elected him to do, which is enforce our immigration laws. The President stands with ICE. I stand with ICE. We stand with all of our law enforcement officers.
Again, I think that a huge part of that is true. When he says nobody debates that she was aiming the car at the officer, that's under debate because it's possible that she was trying to avoid the officer, but she did hit the officer with the car. I mean, she nudged the officer at the very least with the front bumper of the car on tape. The vice president also went off on Tim Walz. Our very own Mary Margaret Olahan asked him the question over in the White House press room.
I wanted to read a quote from Tim Walz earlier today. He said, "When things looked bleak, it was Minnesota's first that held the line for the nation on July 3rd, 1863, and I think we may be in that moment now." Can you comment on his rhetoric and Mayor Jacob Frey and whether they want to see unrest in Minneapolis?
Well, that's very tough rhetoric from a guy who just quit because his fraudulent activities have been uncovered. Look, Tim Walz is a joke. His entire administration has been a joke. The idea that he's some sort of freedom fighter, he's not. He's a guy who has enabled fraud and maybe, in fact, has participated in fraud. That's what this new Assistant Attorney General position is going to find out.
Hey, so, again, if the two polarized positions here are Democrats say all law enforcement bad, and Republicans say, well, this lady was violating the law and was aiming her car at the police officer. Again, it is amazing to me that Democrats are going to take the law enforcement is bad position. That is an insane position to take. Just politically speaking, it's bad. J.D. Vance also pointed out that, yes, the death is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy not just personally. It's a tragedy of far left ideology that obscures the realities about what law enforcement is doing.
But the simple fact is, what you see is what you get in this case. You have a woman who is trying to obstruct a legitimate law enforcement operation. Nobody debates that. You have a woman who aimed her car at a law enforcement officer and pressed on the accelerator. Nobody debates that. I can believe that her death is a tragedy while also recognizing that it's a tragedy of her own making and a tragedy of the far left who has marshaled an entire movement, a lunatic fringe against our law enforcement officers.
Yeah. Again, the vice president is not wrong here. Well, again, a lot of this is also tied up in what's going on in terms of the fraud cases in Minnesota. The reason that Tim Walz is going so hard here is because Tim Walz just had to step away from his third-term run because of the fraud in which he has been caught up, a fraud largely emanating from the Somali community, which, of course, is the community at issue in these immigration raids from ICE. Again, all of this is tied up with the massive fraud scandal that has engulfed the state of Minnesota. According to Scott Bessent, the IRS has uncovered somewhere between $300 and $600 billion in fraud on a national level at this point.
We're not going to have that. We're going to hold people accountable. We're going to press this to the full extent possible. And like I said, I think that this may just be, it's a cold day outside, so this could be the tip of the iceberg here in Minnesota, but it's probably may not be as prevalent, but the dollars may be bigger and larger in other states.
Yeah, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, also is now going to use mechanisms for cutting down on fraud to cut down on remittances if you're on public assistance. The idea being if you're receiving welfare, you shouldn't take American taxpayer dollars that are meant to help you and then send those over to al-Shabaab in Somalia.
if a certain amount of money gets wired anywhere.
$10,000, right?
So we're lowering that to $3,000.
Oh, good.
And we're also targeting the 2 counties here, and we're going to do enhanced surveillance. And from now on, anyone who wires money out from one of these money service businesses has to check a box saying whether they are on public assistance. And if you are on public assistance, we are going to start pushing that you cannot wire money out of the country.
Oh.
And the Department of Homeland Security, by the way, has now unleashed investigators to go door to door collecting evidence and investigating fraud in Minneapolis and across the country, according to their X account. The Trump administration will follow the law and is not afraid to use denaturalization and deportation. If you're complicit in defrauding the American people, they say, your days are numbered. Right? Fraud is the thing that is lying at the root of an enormous amount of this. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, he said yesterday that there will be the creation of a new Assistant Attorney General dedicated specifically to prosecution of fraud.
We have over 1,500 subpoenas that the Department of Justice has issued to get to the heart of the fraud ring. We've done almost 100 indictments, mostly Somali immigrants, but also a few others. And of course, we're looking in with broad investigatory authority to a number of the instances of wrongdoing that we've seen in Minneapolis. But we also want to expand this. We know that the fraud isn't just happening in Minneapolis, it's also happening in states like Ohio. It's happening in states like California. And so what we're doing in order to help coordinate this remarkable interagency effort from the Trump administration, but also to make sure that we prosecute the bad guys and do it as swiftly and efficiently as possible, is we are creating a new Assistant Attorney General position who will have nationwide jurisdiction over the issue of fraud.
Apparently, according to KSTP.com as well, Minnesota DHS employees backdated and created documentation in a behavioral health grant program. Fraud in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. This sort of stuff is incredibly, incredibly common. The Equality Learning Center, which of course was the center of a huge amount of ire, given the video from Nick Shirley that went essentially door to door to these various daycare facilities that he claimed were defrauding the Minnesotan taxpayer. Apparently, they have now closed officially. That would be the Quality Learning Center. You remember that their sign was missing an N. Quality Learning Center closed on Tuesday, according to the Minnesota Department of Human Services licensing records. And they're unable to reopen without reapplying for a license, apparently. The biggest problem for Democrats, what's amazing, truly, if you're a Democrat and if you believe in bigger government spending, more welfare, more taxpayer money flowing from certain people to other people, you should hate fraud, right? You should be very anti-fraud because fraud totally undermines your program. Fraud means that the money that you want to go to this poor person is instead going to this person who is buying himself a Mercedes. Fraud means that the money that you are saying to the taxpayer, we are taking from you to give to this other person who's poor, that money's not going to the poor guy. It's going to somebody who's bilking you. They should be the angriest about fraud. In the same way, if I found out that someone was embezzling from our company, I would be very, very, very angry as an owner of the company. If you are a Democrat and you quote unquote own the government, you should be upset about people embezzling, which is what that is, from the government. And yet Democrats are very, very defensive about fraud. They seem not to care very much about fraud. In fact, they seem to facilitate the fraud in many cases, which is totally crazy. Unless you believe that the fraud is sort of the point. That the way that they want to spread money around is corrupt. Because otherwise they should be angry, right? They should be the first in line to say fraudsters need to be prosecuted. They should be deploying law enforcement themselves to crack down on the fraud. It's their programs, after all. They want to claim credit for them. Well, the mayor of Seattle doesn't feel that way. The mayor of Seattle was asked about looking into fraud claims, and she said, nah, not so interested.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fear in the Somali community is real. The fear in immigrant communities are real, so we're taking that very seriously.
Along those lines, have you asked anyone to follow up on the fraud claims, either to the Department of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs or SPD?
No.
Okay, and again, I think one of the reasons they don't want to look into the fraud is because an inherent part of growing the government this big and making it this intrusive is more fraud. New York, by the way, is talking about initiating larger programs that will be replete with even more fraud. So Kathy Hochul and Zohran Mamdani have announced a plan to make New York childcare universal. The amount of Mamdani, by the way, says that he wants to focus specifically on home-based providers. Okay, home-based providers, that would be like you pay somebody in their home to stay in their home to care for children, or you hire grandma to care for the kids, or whatever. This is a system that is begging for fraud, begging for it. Here is Zohar Mamdani, happy to facilitate the defrauding of the taxpayer.
Not only when we make pre-K truly universal, but expand this care to include all 2- and 3-year-olds across the city. As the governor said, we will deliver to care by working in partnership with childcare providers, especially home-based providers.
They're very excited about the home-based providers because you know how hard it is to monitor that? It's almost impossible to monitor home-based providers that you're sponsoring with welfare dollars because they're in the home. How do you do it? Really, really, really difficult. By the way, there was a report released in August 2024 in New York in which the state comptroller, Thomas DiNapoli, revealed that over the past couple of decades, audits of private preschool special education providers, that is a minor, like tiny subset of childcare providers, identified $113 million in mismanaged or fraudulent expenses. The federal government alleges billions of dollars in mismanagement and fraud here, which would not be surprising in the slightest. Meanwhile, Kathy Hochul says New York is going to spend $4.5 billion on childcare. How much of that is going to flow to actual childcare? And how much of that is going to flow to people who are defrauding the system?
Oh, this year we're committing an additional $1.7 billion in what we call recurring spending, something my budget director hates, but meaning we're committed. So that means our total child care investment this year will be $4.5 billion in the state of New York.
Okay, by the way, she's going to have to tap existing funding because she doesn't want to increase the taxes. So we'll see how that works out for her. And according to the New York Times, if and when the funding is secured, the city and state would have to tackle an enormous operational challenge that would involve hiring and training scores of teachers and constructing a high-quality, unified system out of a scattered existing network of childcare providers in schools, daycare centers, and private homes. But he says that he wants more private homes involved. This is going to be a disaster area. It's going to be a disaster area. Hochul wants to spend an additional nearly $2 billion on the expansion plan. And this is just going to spread the fraud like wildfire. It's going to satisfy people who will then create, you would imagine, unions to bilk the taxpayer of even more money. And state growth cannot happen without high levels of fraud. And that is one of the reasons why people are very against even investigating fraud in blue states, where they should be, again, the most in favor of cracking down on fraud. Well, meanwhile, on the international front, protests in Iran have continued to roil the country. In fact, the Iranian government apparently shut down the internet last night entirely, which is usually a cover for them massacring people. Now, large-scale protests are an amazing thing, but if they don't materialize in terms of actual power, then we've seen this show before, where the Iranian government simply goes out in the streets and starts murdering people willy-nilly. It happened in 2022. It happened back in 2009 under Barack Obama. Would not be a shock to see something like that happen again. President Trump has made clear he does not want to see that happen again. Yesterday, he was on with Hugh Hewitt, and he said that Iran knows that if they engage in this sort of slaughter of people, that the United States will, in fact, stop them from doing that.
As you know, probably better than anybody, they're doing very poorly. And I have let them know that if they start killing people, which they tend to do during their riots, they have lots of riots, if they do it, we're going to hit them very hard.
Now, President Trump was asked also by Hugh Hewitt about meeting with Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of the former Shah. And he has sort of taken a very public position as the protest leader. Again, it's unclear how many of the protesters there are supportive of the return of a Shahdom or whether it is an entirely different movement. Trump himself says that's not really the issue. The issue here is the protests themselves.
Would you meet with Crown Prince Pahlavi, who is the heir to the constitutional monarchy? He doesn't want to rule. He would be a symbolic ruler like King Charles.
Well, I've watched him, and he seems like a nice person, but I'm not sure that it would be appropriate at this point to do that as president. I think that we should let everybody go out there and we see who emerges. I'm not sure necessarily that it would be an appropriate thing to do.
President Trump did say that he is following closely what has been happening in Iran, and that if Iran goes out and starts shooting people in the streets, that there will be consequences to that.
In the past, they've started shooting the hell out of people, and all of a sudden people without any weapons whatsoever are standing there and you have machine guns gunning them down, or they take them to prisons and then hang them and kill them. So they played rough, and I said, if they do that, we're going to hit them very hard. Well, we're going to hit them hard. We're ready to do it. If they do that, we're going to hit them hard. And so far, for the most part, there's been some of it, but for the most part, they haven't. There have been people killed. Some of them, the crowds are so big that some of them have had really, like, were stomped on. Literally, it was terrible. The crowds are just, they're massive. The enthusiasm to overturn that regime is incredible. But there's been people killed, but it's more from death by, it's literally stomping. It's people running in a certain direction. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens over there. They know, though, that it's a stampede, is, I guess, the best word. They have like a stampede. You talk about stampede for cattle. But the people are stampeding, and you're losing a lot of people with the stampedes. There's so many people protesting. Nobody's ever seen anything like what's happening right now.
Now, again, it may be that those protests turn into a full-scale regime change. It may also be that you require somebody in the IRGC, in the Iranian echelon, to end the Ayatollah's rule. It is true that if there were some sort of security umbrella provided by the West to prevent protesters from being mowed down in the streets, that would fundamentally change the game. Presumably, that is why Ayatollah Khamenei is lashing out at President Trump. He gave a speech last night in the middle of the internet blackout in which he essentially told the Iranians that President Trump is the bad guy, which is something Iranians do not believe is a general rule.
His hands stained with the blood of over 1,000 of Iranians. In the 12-day war, over 1,000 people from, apart from generals, scientists, and others, from masses of people, they were martyred. And he said that I commanded the war. So he admitted that his hands were stained with the blood of Iranians, but he's claimed that he supports the Iranian people, and a number of people without experience that do not pay attention, without vigilance, believe what he says and acts according to his will.
Well, of course, the Israeli operation last year was designed to defenestrate the Iranian nuclear facilities. It was a highly targeted operation directed at the IRGC in particular, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Khamenei, in those remarks, said Trump should mind his own business. We will not tolerate protesters serving foreign interests. Now, what's amazing is that these protesters are, in fact, not propped up by foreign interests. These protesters are apparently in the millions out there protesting in the streets against the Iranian regime that has been unable not only to provide security, but unable to provide even water and power. Here is some of the video from the protest. This would have been the night before last. You can see these are massive, massive protests. In fact, in one city called Khorramabad, the lion and sun flag, which was the flag of the Iranian government prior to the takeover of the country by the Ayatollahs, was raised in Khorramabad in Loristan province. You can see that happening. So we may be on the verge of something major. And then again, it may be that the Iranians roll out the guns and start mowing people down and the West doesn't respond, which would be true to the West's form over the course of the last several decades. We'll find out in fairly short order. Meanwhile, the United States continues to pursue a change of policy in Venezuela. Obviously, the goal is to have the existing structure in Venezuela change its behavior, leading to elections. Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent was speaking at the Minnesota Economic Club, and he said this is not in any way like the Iraq War, which of course is true. The Iraq War required hundreds of thousands of American troops. This is not. Here's Scott Bessent explaining.
This is the anti-Iraq. And in Iraq, Iraq had a big bureaucracy, like hundreds of years, and it was just wiped out, and it was chaos. So for now, we want to stabilize the existing structure and then go from there.
Well, joining us on the line is Secretary of Energy Chris Wright. Yesterday, the president released a fact sheet talking about Venezuela, the oil industry in Venezuela. Secretary Wright, thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So let's talk about why, first of all, the United States is even interested in oil from Venezuela. The sort of general perception in the United States is that we are fully oil independent. We don't need more oil. Is there a difference between Venezuelan oil and the other kind of oil that we are fracking, for example, in Pennsylvania?
There is. The Venezuelan oil is more viscous. It's heavier crude. It's perfect for asphalt and making certain products. Also, in general, it's cheaper. So when a lot of our refineries were built in the 60s and 70s, Venezuela was a major oil supplier to the United States, and we built refineries. It's more capital, more intense refineries that can process this cheaper, high viscosity crude. And then, of course, Venezuela, over the ensuing decades, has fallen off a cliff, destroyed its country through socialism and top-down control. And so we have to find that heavy, viscous crude elsewhere. So yeah, it's beneficial for the U.S. refineries, but really the short-term agenda with Venezuela is stop the criminality, stop the import of drugs and gangs and violence into the United States. It's just made our hemisphere a worse place to do business and a worse place to prosper. We want to fix Venezuela because that's good for Americans. Of course, it'll be good for Venezuelans too.
So, Secretary, looking at the release that you've put out at the Energy Department, you say that it's going to help unleash prosperity and peace across the Western Hemisphere, this current U.S.-Venezuela energy deal, which would leave the United States in charge, essentially, of oil sales and disbursements therefrom. Explain how that would work.
Yes. So, look, people for 25 years have tried to stop the slide to destruction that Venezuela's been in, and President Trump just found a more creative idea. Look, there have been sanctions on Venezuelan oil, but unfortunately, they're just poorly enforced. The president said, look, they're so dependent on oil sales and drug sales as a side business, but their biggest cash source is oil sales. We're going to enforce the sanctions and embargo their oil, seal off their ability to export oil. Boy, that got a big change in the ability to dialogue with the Venezuelan government. So the agreement now is, all right, you're going to be able to sell your oil, but we're going to sell your oil. So we're just going to control the flow of Venezuelan oil. When the United States sells it, we're going to get a much higher price than the Venezuelans would get. It's not black market. It's not shadow market. It's not a criminal regime that's on the other side of that transaction. It's the United States government. So we're going to sell that oil into the marketplace, generate more money than they would have, put it in accounts that are controlled by the United States government, and then at our discretion, just deliver those funds to Venezuela. So it's going to bring more money into the country, but it's going to bring massive U.S. influence that we're only going to deliver the money and continue this arrangement if they make rapid progress on reforms, end the criminality, end the threats to the United States, start to restore rule of law back in Venezuela. I think the president is right. We're going to be able to use this tool to drive them in a positive direction. That's going to benefit Americans, and it's going to benefit Venezuelans as well.
Well, it's that latter part that I think is extraordinarily important. And a lot of critics of the president's action against Nicolas Maduro have suggested that nothing is fundamentally going to change on the ground in Venezuela, that Maduro will be gone, but Venezuela will continue to be a socialist dictatorship because, of course, the vice president of Venezuela, who is now taken over, Delcy Rodriguez, is an ardent socialist herself. In public, she's made very pro-Maduro statements, even after the extradition of the drug offender that is Nicolas Maduro. So the case that the administration seems to be making, correct me if I'm wrong, is that given the fact that the vast majority of income possible to Venezuela will now be flowing through American hands, that money just doesn't get to Venezuela unless reforms occur that move Venezuela in the direction of rule of law and future elections.
Very well stated, Ben. That's exactly the thing. And there's huge incentives here. If they start to move in those positive directions, what does that mean? That means American businesses are going to go back into Venezuela. Venezuelans' oil production is going to grow again, which is going to generate more revenue, more money for them. But you're right. We're going to use that leverage. This money is only flowing if things improve in Venezuela. Their interactions with the United States change dramatically, and they start to improve their country. Ultimately, this is a process that will take some time. But at the end of the day, we want to see representative government, democracy, freedom, pro-American government in power in Venezuela. That's a transition from where they are today. Absolutely. That's a process. But we want to do that through a process without it becoming a failed state or going back to the narco-terrorist state it's been for the last 20 years.
So, Secretary, one of the other questions that's arisen here is getting American companies involved in the oil industry in Venezuela requires a level of stability and an assurance that things aren't going to take a turn for the worse, that Venezuela isn't going to renationalize its oil fields as soon as, for example, President Trump is out of office, or the United States is not going to simply walk away from this arrangement and leave American companies who do require years and years of investment in order to see any sort of recapitalization holding the bag. What sort of measures is the Trump administration looking forward to taking for the long term that ensure the security of investments and that transitional process?
Yes, and so there's talk about, they need, tens of billions of dollars to rebuild massive infrastructure. That's true, and that'll take a long time. That's not going to start next week. But what is going to happen, Chevron's been there for 100 years continuously. Now we're going to have a constructive Venezuelan government, a more active involvement from the U.S. government. Can Chevron expand and grow their operations like starting tomorrow? Yes, they can. Do they want to do that? Yes, they do. So it's not a matter of the government having to twist anyone's arm or make stuff or even give them guarantees. They just see President Trump and the U.S. government's involvement automatically makes business conditions better in Venezuela, and they've been operating under the existing conditions. These are improving business conditions today. And companies that recently left or been looking to go in, they're like, hey, now I think is a good time. People are going to go in slowly. The rate of investment is going to pick up from near nothing to a meaningful amounts. But the $10 billion, 10-year development projects, they may not start for another year or two. But that's okay. The trajectory's been only downward. The trajectory immediately is going to be upward. Ben, I've guessed we could have 30, 40, 50% higher Venezuelan oil production 12 to 18 months from now than we have today. In fact, I think it's quite likely that will happen.
Well, that's Secretary of Energy Chris Wright. Again, it's an amazing thing the Trump administration has done. We look forward to the fulfilling of that sort of potential. Secretary, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Ben. Appreciate you.
Alrighty, coming up, we are going to talk about what's going on in Cuba, which may be ready to fall as well. Plus, Conan O'Brien says something true about comedy, and we'll have some economic updates. First, in order to watch, you have to be a member. If you're not a member, become a member. Use code Shapiro at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. Click that link in the description and join us. The United States seizes a Venezuelan oil tanker. Is war near, or is something else happening? Plus, what is our strategy on Russia, on China? First, our brand new Daily Wire talent, Matt Fradd, just released a special Christmas episode of Pints with Aquinas. It's streaming now on Daily Wire Plus. It's smart, it's meaningful, it's exactly what you want during the Christmas season. And right now, our Daily Wire Plus Christmas sale is live. New annual memberships are 40% off. Already a member? Well, you can give an annual membership to somebody for 50% off. Watch Matt Fradd's Christmas episode and get the Daily Wire Plus Christmas deal right now at dailywire.com. So the big news of the day is that the United States has now seized a very large oil tanker off the Venezuelan coast. President Trump announced this yesterday. He announced that the United States had pursued the seizure of a Venezuelan oil tanker. It was headed to Cuba. Attorney General Pam Bondi said the U.S. Coast Guard, the FBI, and Homeland Security investigations executed that seizure warrant for a crude oil tanker used to transport oil from Venezuela and Iran in defiance of sanctions. This is according to the Washington Post. Here was the president yesterday.
As you probably know, we've just seized a tanker on the coast of Venezuela, large tanker, very large. Largest one ever seized, actually. And other things are happening, so you'll be seeing that later, and you'll be talking about that later with some other people.
The president did not, in fact, make clear what all those other things might be, although, of course, he has said before that there may be some operations that are authorized not just in the water, but also on the land. And there's been talk about a no-fly zone established above Venezuela. All of this is external pressure, presumably, to force the possibility of a regime change in Venezuela without serious threat to American troops going in en masse on the ground. That oil tanker, according to the Washington Post, had been sanctioned by the United States, according to Attorney General Bondi, due to its involvement in an illicit oil shipping network supporting foreign terrorist organizations. And then she also shared a video that shows U.S. forces jumping out of helicopters and searching the large vessel on foot. Here's what that looks like. So here you can see this gigantic oil tanker, huge oil tanker, and an American helicopter, and you can see soldiers rappelling down onto this oil tanker, presumably to go look for the oil, to confiscate it, to stop the ship from moving toward its target. Yeah, again, the United States military is unparalleled at what it does. You can see these soldiers with their guns drawn moving toward the control booth. That's an impressive thing. Again, when the United States military comes, it doesn't play around. President Trump described the vessel as both very large and the largest one ever seized, actually. He also said, when asked what would happen to the oil, well, maybe we'll keep it.
What happens to the oil on this ship? Well, we keep it, I guess.
Where does it go? What port does it go to?
Well, you have to follow the tanker. You know, you're a good newsman. Just follow the tanker.
Do you know where it was going? Was it going
follow
to
it.
China?
Get a helicopter and follow the tanker.
Is it true it's going to
But we're
Cuba?
going to, I assume we're going to keep the oil.
Well, the President of the United States has always made no bones about the fact that he believes that if the United States is engaged in armed conflict somewhere, that we should keep the spoils that we reap. You remember he said that about the Iraq War. He suggested, hey, if you're going to actually do that war, then you may as well take the oil as some form of compensation. When it comes to the Venezuelan government shipping oil over to Iran in violation of sanctions, or allowing the Iranians to combine their oil with Venezuelan oil and ship that elsewhere and ship the money back to Iran, obviously keeping the spoils would be worthwhile. One person familiar with the seizure in the administration told the Washington Post, quote, depending on what legal justification they use to seize the vessel, it could create a lot of problems for the regime. This, of course, comes amidst the Trump administration blowing Venezuelan drug boats out of the water. Venezuelan oil is one of the biggest sponsors of Cuba. Cuba, of course, has heavy sanctions on it. It doesn't have a very strong independent economy at all. The communist island nation has had extensive blackouts this year. Very little of that Venezuelan oil is going to Cuba. But if it turns out that the United States is now prepared to interdict all oil that may or may not be headed for Iran or from Iran, then this could absolutely cripple the Venezuelan economy even more than it already has. Again, according to Francisco Minaldi, a director of the Latin America Energy Program at Rice University, if the Trump administration continues to seize oil tankers in a systematic way, targeting those particularly destined for China, that could significantly limit the willingness of black market fleets to go to Venezuela, dealing a major economic blow to Nicolas Maduro. And again, economic crisis could easily precipitate some sort of palace coup or the military deciding to overthrow Maduro if you could find somebody to actually do it. A huge percentage of Venezuela's economy is dependent on oil exports. We asked our friends and sponsors over at Comet, a project of perplexity, what percentage of Venezuela's economy is dependent on oil exports. And according to Comet, Venezuela's economy is highly dependent on oil, mainly through its impact on exports and government revenue. Apparently, oil accounts for over 80 to 90% of all total export earnings in recent years. So if that were to shut down, you'd basically collapse whatever is left of the Venezuelan economy. And that seems to be something that the United States is pursuing at this point. The president also has been making clear that he is going to put pressure on Gustavo Petro over in Colombia. Colombia, of course, is historically a relatively conservative state. Gustavo Petro, the Colombian president, is more oriented toward China, toward Iran. He is a far-left socialist. President Trump was asked about Petro's criticism of U.S. strikes on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean. Petro referred to those efforts as barbarian. Here's President Trump warning Petro that he better wise up.
Have you considered talking to the president of Colombia, who you call a drug dealer?
No, I haven't really thought too much about him. He's been fairly hostile to the United States, and I haven't given him a lot of thought. He's going to have himself some big problems if he doesn't wise up. Colombia is producing a lot of drugs. They have cocaine factories that they make cocaine, as you know, and they sell it right into the United States. So he better wise up, or he'll be next. He'll be next too. And I hope he's listening. He's going to be next. Yes,
Mr. President.
Because we don't like people when they kill people. And they sell drugs. They kill them in the United States. And Colombia is a major manufacturer of drugs, meaning cocaine in particular.
Okay, so the United States could obviously put pressure on the Petro regime in Colombia. The next scheduled election for president in Colombia happens next May. So there's every possibility that Petro could be in trouble as well. All of this seems to be part of a broader national security strategy pursued by the White House. That national security strategy, which we talked about at length just the other day, focuses a lot on South America, on Latin America. It focuses specifically on the idea that the United States ought to be the dominant power in our own hemisphere. So, according to that national security document, the foreign influence of China or of Iran or of Russia in the Western Hemisphere ought to stop. Quote, the United States must be preeminent in the Western Hemisphere as a condition of our security and prosperity, a condition that allows us to assert ourselves confidently where and when we need to in the region. The terms of our alliances and the terms upon which we may provide any kind of aid must be contingent on winding down adversarial outside influence, from control of military installations, ports, and key infrastructure to the purchase of strategic assets broadly defined. The United States has achieved success, says the national security strategy, in rolling back outside influence in the Western Hemisphere by demonstrating with specificity how many hidden costs are embedded in allegedly low-cost foreign assistance. In other words, we've told other countries that if they take Chinese help, well, they may be also taking Chinese surveillance and debt traps. In the Western Hemisphere, according to the national security strategy, the United States should make clear that American goods, services, and technologies are a far better buy in the long run because they are higher quality and do not come with the same kind of strings as other countries' assistance. So, the national security strategy of the United States is very much a sort of muscular Monroe doctrine, suggesting that the Western Hemisphere be made clear of outside influence. Alrighty, coming up, we'll get to other threats to the United States. Which ones are we facing down? First, this episode is sponsored by Pure Talk. As a consumer, you carry the success or failure of businesses in the palm of your hand. Their success depends on your decision to spend money with them or their competitor. Well, my friends at Pure Talk would like to say thank you from the bottom of their hearts for choosing Pure Talk for your wireless needs. Because of you, they've had a record-breaking year. Because of your generosity through their Roundup for Charity program, they've been able to donate over $500,000 to America's Warrior Partnership, who stand on the front lines of preventing veteran suicide. Your patronage has allowed Pure Talk to donate 1,000 hand-sewed Made in America flags to your fellow veterans. And when you choose Pure Talk as your wireless provider, you also choose to support American jobs. Like I said, as a consumer, you have the power to make or break companies. With the money the big wireless guys throw around on advertising, you're inundated with offers pretty much all the time. So, from everybody in the Pure Talk family, thank you for your trust, and God bless America. By the way, you're getting a great deal when you head on over to Pure Talk anyway. Best coverage, best price, great company. Help America, help Pure Talk. Go check them out right now. Also, this episode is sponsored by Good Ranchers. You know what I miss most when I'm traveling for work? Sitting down with my wife and kids for a real meal. Not just eating, actually being together. I'm missing them right now. That's why this holiday season, I encourage everybody to give Good Ranchers to the people you care about. Because here's the thing. A Good Ranchers gift isn't just premium, 100% American-raised meat. It's an invitation. The box shows up, someone fires up the grill or preheats a skillet or the oven, and suddenly everybody is gathered around the table, talking, laughing, actually connecting. That's what the holidays are really about. Producer Savvy and her family love Good Ranchers. And her baby, oh my gosh, he is a gigantic baby because of the Good Ranchers. She is sending a box to her mother-in-law for some brownie points. Spend less time prepping holiday meals this season and more time with the people you love. Giving a Good Ranchers box is simple. Just pick a box, add a note, schedule delivery, and while you're at goodranchers.com, grab a subscription for yourself as well. Use my code BEN for $40 off. Plus, when you subscribe, you get free bacon, free Wagyu burgers, or free chicken thighs in every order for life. That is code BEN at goodranchers.com for $40 off plus free meat for life. Goodranchers.com. Let's get back to the table. Now, realistically speaking, the threats to the United States, other than immigration, which of course has been a threat, but is a threat that has been largely mitigated by closing our southern border, the threats to the United States are predominantly not from South America and Latin America. Yes, what happens in the Western Hemisphere has an impact on us. What happens with regard to China and Russia has an even larger impact on us because the world is much, much smaller than it was when James Monroe was president. And thus, I find it sort of bizarre that the Trump administration is at the same time attempting to overthrow the Maduro regime via economic pressure. That appears to be what they're doing. But also, at the same time, to somehow allow for the possibility of an increased Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. This makes zero sense to me. Russia, Venezuela, these are allies. China is an ally. Iran is an ally. North Korea is an ally. It is a network of allied far-left states and or Islamist states. And fighting one, but making nice with the others is unlikely to result in anything to America's benefit. A broadening of the Russian sphere of influence is not going to make America stronger. And the reality is, as much as President Trump likes to dunk on the Europeans, and hell, I enjoy a good windmill jam on the Europeans from time to time, the notion that we somehow hold more in common with Vladimir Putin than we do with the Europeans, broadly speaking, is nonsense. It is not true. We hold virtually nothing in common with Vladimir Putin. Contrary to popular expectation and opinion, Russia is not, in fact, a state that is wildly pro-religion. Russia is not, in fact, a state that agrees with us on foreign policy perspectives. It is not a country that seeks its own sphere of influence without any reference to the United States. It actually believes it ought to be not just a regional power, but a global power in opposition to the United States. Which is why a brand new plan, apparently unveiled by the Wall Street Journal, with regard to Ukraine is somewhat disturbing. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Trump administration in recent weeks has handed its European counterparts a series of documents, each a single page, laying out its vision for the reconstruction of Ukraine and the return of Russia to the global economy. The proposals have sparked an intense battle at the negotiating table between America and its traditional allies in Europe. The outcome stands to profoundly alter the economic map of the continent. The U.S. blueprint has been spelled out apparently in appendices to current peace proposals. They're not public, but they've been described to the Wall Street Journal. Those documents detail plans for U.S. financial firms and other businesses to tap roughly $200 billion of frozen Russian assets for projects in Ukraine, including a massive new data center to be powered by a nuclear plant currently occupied by Russian troops. Another appendix, however, offers America's broad strokes vision for bringing Russia's economy in from the cold, with the U.S. investing in strategic sectors from rare earth extraction to drilling for oil in the Arctic and helping to restore Russian energy flows to Western Europe and the rest of the world. Which, again, is pretty astonishing. And basically, it is saying, okay, we'll take a little bit of your money to pay for some projects and rebuilding in Ukraine, and maybe that sweetens the deal for Ukraine. But we'll then reopen the world economy to Russia. Well, if that happens and Russia has a vast influx of cash, you think they're going to sit still on Ukraine for very long? The minute that they sense vulnerability, they will move. Apparently, in a call Wednesday, President Trump discussed the peace process with French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The rumor is, very strong rumor, that the Trump administration has basically told the Ukrainians they need to sign on the dotted line by Christmas or U.S. support will go away, which of course would be incredibly self-defeating. Russia would love for U.S. support to go away. And by the way, the Europeans are beginning to act. The European Parliament and member state governments, according to the Journal, finalized a legislative agreement to phase out all Russian pipeline gas within 2 years. Again, this move by the Trump administration to make nice with the Russians, it's hard to see that as anything other than a bizarre attempt to allow for spheres of influence, not just with regard to Russia, but also, as we'll discuss momentarily, with China. For Ukraine, the question is why you would sign a deal when the United States is cutting support to Ukraine in the middle of a war now. Why would Ukraine believe that if Russia attacks again, the United States will rush back in with all of its resources? Apparently, according to Axios, Ukraine has now given the Trump administration its point-by-point response to the latest draft of the U.S. peace plan. Apparently, Zelensky's national security advisor and chief negotiator, Rustem Umerov, sent the Ukrainian response to Jared Kushner, President Trump's advisor and son-in-law. A Ukrainian official said the response includes comments and proposed amendments to make the whole thing doable. So is there a middle ground here? Here's my problem. Have we heard any response from the Russians whatsoever on what they are willing to do? Have they moved one iota? Have they moved 1 inch since the beginning of the war in terms of their demands? Or at least since the latest iteration of demands, which mostly happened about 3 years ago? The answer seems to be no. Meanwhile, what exactly are we doing with China? Now, it may very well be that right now we have some military problems in the Far East that make China the favorite in a local or regional war in that arena. According to the UK Telegraph, China would defeat the U.S. military in a war over Taiwan, according to a top-secret U.S. government assessment. U.S. reliance on costly, sophisticated weapons leaves it exposed to China's ability to mass-produce cheaper systems in overwhelming numbers, according to a highly classified Overmatch brief. A national security official under President Biden who reviewed the document is said to have turned pale on realizing Beijing had redundancy and after redundancy for every trick we had up our sleeve. So in the brief, which examines what would happen if the U.S. went to war with China over Taiwan, for example, the USS Gerald R. Ford would be sent to that arena where it would likely be destroyed. Again, that's because China is engaged in drone warfare. Also, they have ship-destroying YJ-17 missiles that travel at 8 times the speed of sound. And yet the United States continues to play a bizarre game with its defense industries where we fight yesterday's war. Apparently, the Pentagon is planning to build 9 additional Ford-class aircraft carriers, but it hasn't deployed a single hypersonic missile as of yet. According to Eric Gomez, a research fellow at the Taiwan Security Monitor, he said he did his own war game between the United States and China over Taiwan. He said even if the U.S. would win, the U.S. would suffer heavy losses, including a lot of ships. A lot of F-35s and other tactical aircraft in the theater are degraded pretty rapidly as well. He said, I think the high cost of it was really sobering when we did the after-action summaries. We were like, okay, you guys lost 100 plus 5th-generation aircraft, multiple destroyers, a couple of submarines, a couple of carriers. So, is our advantage in that arena real enough for us to take on China? Again, this is why rebuilding the military is absolutely necessary, and getting creative about how exactly we do that would be absolutely necessary as well. It's also why it would be worthwhile to listen to Sham Sankar, who's been a guest on our program, the CTO at Palantir, who's been talking for a while about modernizing our military procurement strategy and fighting future wars, not the wars of the past. Well, if we are going to face down China, is it a good idea for the president to let NVIDIA sell its H200 chip to China? According to the Wall Street Journal editorial board, President Trump's move to ease export controls on computer chips illustrates his confusing China policy to the extent he has one. In the first term, he changed America's China debate as a trade and security hawk. 8 years later, he's sounding like the post-Cold War globalist he denounces, who thought the lure of commerce would make the world safer. According to the Journal, one reason is that Beijing's semiconductor industrial policy has resulted in colossal waste and mismanagement. Huawei has struggled designing high-end and high-powered chips needed to train those advanced AI models, and this has frustrated Beijing, which presumably is why China keeps trying to smuggle NVIDIA H200 chips into the country. Now President Trump wants to allow China to just buy those H200s without any strings attached. So is that a smart move? The 25% tax payments that NVIDIA will pay to the Treasury Department, that is not enough to pay for the possibility of a competitive China in the AI sphere. And it's hard to read that as anything other than a sort of tacit recognition of Chinese power in the Far East or Russian power in Eastern Europe, none of which is going to redound to the benefit of the world. The United States as the world's global hegemon, you're going to miss it when it's gone. That doesn't mean that we ought to police every single thing happening on planet Earth. It does mean that we do have to push our opponents geopolitically off the ball. Well, I will say that at least the House seems to be moving towards something useful. The House on Wednesday apparently approved a $900 billion defense policy bill that gives U.S. troops a raise and codifies a lot of President Trump's national security agenda. It seeks to curb his pullback from Europe and mandate more Pentagon consultation with Congress. The bill goes to the Senate. It will probably pass there as well. So, again, we actually do need a military rebuild. That means contracting to do more sophisticated things, newer things, robotics, AI, all the rest. We can't just build yesterday's aircraft carriers anymore and hope to defeat our enemies. More on the economy in just one moment. First, common sense. What's the common sense approach to keeping your home and family safe? Would it be to take action after somebody is already inside? Well, no, that does not seem smart. But that is what most security companies offer. Our sponsor, SimpliSafe, does the opposite. They stop criminals before they enter your home. Now, that sounds like common sense to me. Before, not after. And they do it with a double layer of defense. First, they've got AI cameras that detect threats early. And here's the key thing. They alert live agents, real people who actually speak directly to intruders. Hello, what are you doing? You're being watched. I would leave. And you know what? They actually do leave, because if they do not leave, then police are getting dispatched. Now that is common sense. That's real security. There are no long-term contracts, no hidden fees. You can cancel anytime. We love SimpliSafe here at the studio. It means that everything is where we left it when we come in the next morning. SimpliSafe has been rated best home security systems by U.S. News & World Report for 5 years running. They back it up with a 60-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it and see the difference for yourself. This month only, take 50% off any new system. This is one of the best prices you will ever see for SimpliSafe. Don't miss it. Hit simplysafe.com/Shapiro. Again, that's simplysafe.com/Shapiro and lock in your discount. There is no safe like SimpliSafe. Also, tons of people are focused on where their money is today. Our sponsor, Acorns, is the financial wellness app that cares about where your money is going tomorrow. And with the Acorns potential screen, you can find out what your money is capable of. Acorns is a smart way to give your money a chance to grow, making investing accessible whether you're just starting out or planning for the future. You can sign up in minutes and start automatically investing your spare money, even if all you've got is spare change. As your life evolves, Acorns grows with you, supporting both your big and small goals across every stage. The Acorns potential screen shows you the power of compounding and how your money could grow over time, while letting you quickly adjust how much you're investing daily, weekly, or monthly to stay on track toward your goals. Best of all, Acorns is all in one, so you can invest, save, and give your money a chance to grow in one trusted place without cluttering your phone with multiple finance apps. Sign up now. Acorns will boost your new account with a $5 bonus investment. Join the over 14 million all-time customers who have already saved and invested over $27 billion with Acorns. Head on over to acorns.com/Shapiro or download the Acorns app to get started. Paid non-client endorsement compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 2 compensation provided, potential subject to various factors such as customers' accounts, age, and investment settings, does not include Acorns fees. Results do not predict or represent the performance of any Acorns portfolio. Investment results will vary. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor, view important disclosures at acorns.com/Shapiro. Now, meanwhile, all of this is dependent on a robust American economy. Yesterday, the Federal Reserve cut the rates as expected by the prediction markets at our sponsor, Kalshi. There were 3 dissents. It wasn't unanimous. According to the Wall Street Journal, Federal Reserve officials cut interest rates for a 3rd straight meeting, but signaled they might be done for now in the midst of unusual divisions over the path forward. That decision to cut the benchmark federal funds rate by a 1/4 point is aimed at protecting against a slowdown in hiring. The Fed voted 9-3. That is the first time in 6 years that there were 3 officials casting dissents. 2 thought there was no use in the reduction. Another actually wanted a much larger reduction, like 1/2 point, as opposed to 0.25%. Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, he said, well, the reason we cut is because job markets actually might be shrinking. It's possible we're missing some data here.
In October, I said that there was no certainty of moving, and that was indeed correct. I said it's possible you could think about it that way, but I was careful to say other people could look at it differently. So why did we move today? I would point to a couple things. First of all, gradual cooling in the labor market has continued. Unemployment is now up 0.3 from June through September. Payroll jobs averaging 40,000 per month since April. We think there's an overstatement in these numbers by about 60,000, so that would be negative 20,000 per month. And also, just to point out one other thing, surveys of households and businesses both show declining supply and demand for workers. So I think you can say that the labor market has continued to cool gradually, maybe just a touch more gradually than we thought.
Okay, so that presumably is what prompted the Federal Reserve to lower those interest rates because, again, there's liquidity in the economy, but the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate: keep inflation low and keep unemployment low. And so if they feel like people are losing their jobs, the idea is inject more liquidity into the economy, put more money in there. That will cause people to spend more, which will cause more people to have jobs. That at least is the logic. Now, with that said, it's also possible that the jobs market is, at least in part, stagnant or shrinking, partially because of, for example, things like, yes, wait for it, tariffs. Jerome Powell pointed out that inflation on the price of goods is, in fact, up because of tariffs. So when you're talking affordability, the tariffs do have an impact.
Total PCE prices rose 2.8% over the 12 months ending in September. And excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices also rose 2.8%. These readings are higher than earlier in the year as inflation for goods has picked up, reflecting the effects of tariffs.
Okay, so, and he said the thing that he's not supposed to say if you don't want to tick off President Trump, but it also happens to be true. When you see an increase in the price of goods that you buy at the grocery store because there is a tax on the goods coming from abroad, obviously you're going to see some inflation. So we have the beginnings of what looks like, not in major measure, but at least a little inkling of what you would call stagflation. Continued too high pricing combined with a jobs market that might be shrinking. Now, is any of that a serious problem? Again, inflation is way down from where it was a year ago. That's true. Also, the employment market continues to remain robust. That is also true. And President Trump is not wrong when he says that the economic pain people are feeling is largely because of Joe Biden. As we've discussed, the vast majority of the inflation that people are currently feeling, meaning like the much higher prices now than there were in 2019, a huge portion of that happened under not President Trump, but under Joe Biden.
I inherited very simply the highest prices in history, and I'm bringing them down really fast, led by energy. And when energy comes down, everything else comes down. But I've only been here a short while, and we gave them a beautiful, beautiful thing, and they destroyed it. They would have destroyed our country had they been allowed to stay. If we didn't win this election, if we had Kamala, who's the same as Joe, low IQ people, but if we had Kamala, you would have a country that would be right now in ruins. I believe that 100%.
And so he is not wrong about that either. With that said, Democrats are, of course, jumping on the political train that is taking them somewhere, and that is suggesting that President Trump is uncaring about the economy. And Chuck Schumer, who again helped preside over much of this for Joe Biden, is out there railing against the president.
What was Donald Trump's solution to affordability? Well, last night, Trump said parents should buy their kids fewer dolls for Christmas. We're not talking about fewer dolls for Christmas. We're talking about necessities like food, like medicine, like fixing your car when it gets damaged, like maybe going to see the grandkids who you haven't seen in 2 years because you can't afford the trip. He said kids at school should have fewer pencils. And then he repeated his favorite word was tariffs. What kind of world does he live in? Does he understand that these tariffs are raising prices through the roof?
Now, again, one of my great annoyances here is that Chuck Schumer is not one to talk. With that said, obviously, if people are concerned about affordability, then you do have to get rid of the policies that are likely to continue to cause inflationary policy. Now, Jerome Powell is going to be gone pretty soon. Kevin Hassett is the person most likely to replace him over the National Economic Council. He also is blaming Democrats for people's dyspepsia about the economy. And again, he's not wrong. I'm not saying Republicans are wrong when they say this. I'm saying it's not an effective political tactic, generally speaking.
The bottom line is that the Democrats are out there saying things that are false, and like they're not holding up charts telling you what's going on. But, we have a chart that showed that the typical family buying a new home saw their mortgage rate go up at an annual rate by $14,000 because of Biden's inflation and the high interest rates that followed from it. And so, people who have to pay $14,000 a year more just to have their home, of course they were harmed a lot by Biden. But already, because we've been getting closer to a balanced budget and leading interest rates down even before we control the Fed more, that we've saved a couple $1,000s of that $14,000 already.
Now, again, none of this is wrong. If, however, you wish for people to see you as an affordability presidency, then you need to announce more policies that lead to affordability. Hassett is likely, again, to chair the Federal Reserve in the near future, and he says that the Fed has been way behind on reducing rates. I'm sorry. The reality is that our inflation rate is still riding 50% higher than it normally is supposed to. So hard for me to believe that they've been that wrong in refusing to reduce the rates.
The fact is that they've been way behind getting the rates down. The economy is doing well, but because of all the supply side action that we've taken, we've got high growth with declining inflation. And so they've got plenty of room to cut rates. They'll do a little bit this time, but they'll probably need to do some more.
Okay, so, we'll see if that's true. But again, if you are reliant, if yelling at the Federal Reserve or changing Federal Reserve policy is your way of somehow establishing economic affordability, and you're talking about lowering the interest rates, not increasing them. You're not going to do the Paul Volcker thing under Ronald Reagan, where inflation is running in double digits, and so you radically increase those interest rates to get the extra money out of the economy. If you're talking about how affordability is a problem, now let me lower the interest rates, I'm not sure that totally scans. Now, meanwhile, again, Democrats are making hay over problems they created in the first place. This is particularly true when it comes to health care. So some frustrated Republicans, according to Politico, are going to force a vote on extending Obamacare health insurance subsidies expiring in just 3 weeks. These are all Republicans from swing states. They're all set to lose their seats, probably, if there's a gigantic spike in the health insurance rates. According to Politico, at least 6 Republicans have signed a discharge petition filed Wednesday on a bill authored by Representatives Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania and Jared Golden of Maine that would extend the expiring tax credits for 2 years while imposing some new eligibility requirements. Fitzpatrick said, "It's a time-sensitive matter. It's an existential matter. You try to do things through the normal course. You try to do them through regular order." This is a move to sidestep Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who, of course, is trying to unify against extending those subsidies. And you can see why the Trump administration and the Speaker of the House, they're not interested in continuing to spend money like water the way the Democrats have. It also happens to be the case that if those insurance rates spike, Republicans will be blamed at the polls. Representative John Rutherford of Florida said, quote, "If we fumble this healthcare ball, nothing else is going to matter. If we don't win the majority in the midterms, none of it matters. We can't do anything good then. I think everybody understands that." Well, Speaker Johnson has presented another menu of options to Republicans. But that menu of options seems to be relatively non-popular with other Republicans who are in those swing state areas. According to Meredith Lee Hill of Politico, House Republican leaders presented no firm plan yesterday for advancing health care legislation as anxiety rose in GOP ranks over the impending expiration of key Obamacare subsidies at the end of the year. So, there are some 10 policies that could get votes in the coming weeks or months. Some were specific, like expansion of HSAs, health savings accounts, or overhauling pharmaceutical benefit manager oversight. Others were pretty vague. The most likely scenario here is a partial extension of the Obamacare subsidies for, say, a year or 2 years in exchange for some policies like, for example, the gradual sunsetting of that and the addition of new health savings accounts, for example, or the higher funding of health savings accounts. Meanwhile, President Trump correctly slammed Obamacare at the White House, saying, it's weird. You guys keep coming back to me for money after telling me it was all going to work.
Well, the Unaffordable Care Act, which is Obamacare, they call it now the unaffordable because it's unaffordable. It used to be called the affordable, but it was never affordable. It was always bad. It was basically designed for the benefit of insurance companies. And what we're doing is we want all of the billions and billions of dollars that went to insurance companies to go directly to the people, and they can buy their own health care. And people love it. I don't know if the Democrats are going to approve it because they want the insurance companies to make money. It was a scam. Obamacare was a scam.
And again, he is not wrong about this. However, the American people, once you get people dependent on government benefits, very difficult to get them non-dependent on those government benefits. Again, Amy Klobuchar, senator from Minnesota, she's taking full advantage.
The plan that we're offering is something that they've had in place before that allows people who are on the Affordable Care Act, 20 million people, to be able to get their insurance premiums that they can pay for and continue their plan. The plans they have is just a made-up thing that is not going to help these people for what they need to be able to afford insurance.
Now, again, your plan seems to be continuous subsidies for literally ever. But this is why Republicans, in the end, are going to have to offer free market-based solutions that are at the state and local level. Because once you start playing this game, once you start playing we can make everything more affordable at the federal government level through subsidies game, you're never going to outbid the Democrats. It's just not going to happen. Alrighty, coming up, Kristi Noem. Is she on the chopping block or not really? First, America is approaching its 250th birthday. It should be a time of celebration. But did you know only 41% of Gen Z say they are actually proud to be American? Why is that number not 100%? We need to fix that fast. Thankfully, there's no organization better positioned to educate young people about the true history of this country than PragerU. For years, young Americans have been fed a steady diet of misinformation, taught to believe this country is racist, sexist, and bigoted. PragerU is correcting the record. They tell the whole story, the good and the bad, but always with accuracy and appreciation for the patriots who sacrificed everything to create the greatest country in human history. Through powerful storytelling, engaging videos, and family-friendly resources, PragerU is reaching the next generation. Millions of young people are finally hearing a message that inspires pride, not shame. And here's something you need to know. While plenty of nonprofits line up for government money, PragerU refused it, even when partnering with the White House. They will not let the government fund their message. That's why they rely on patriotic Americans like you. I've worked with PragerU. I've seen what they do. If we're going to win the fight for the next generation, we need PragerU well-funded. Right now, every dollar you give to PragerU will be triple matched, which means every dollar you give will have 3 times the impact. Go to PragerU.com/DW during the triple match and make your gift today. That's PragerU.com/DW. Also, the Daily Wire Shop's best deals of the year are still live right now, and we're taking up to 70% off conservative gifts for everybody on your list. Gifts like my New York Times bestseller, Lions and Scavengers, signed copies only available at the Daily Wire Shop, plus merch inspired by the book. The new Truth Bomb golf driver and putter covers, they're awesome. The perfect gift for your dad and that fun uncle who likes to drop truth bombs at family gatherings. Every swing, every putt, a reminder that facts don't care about your feelings or your handicap. Sadly, my handicap is far too high. And don't forget about the golden Leftist Tears tumbler, extremely limited supply, only back for a limited time. So many gifts you can't find anywhere else. Head on over to dailywire.com/shop right now. Don't wait. Order by December 15th for delivery by Christmas. That's dailywire.com/shop. Meanwhile, President Trump has announced that he has no intentions of firing the Department of Homeland Security head Kristi Noem. There had been a lot of speculation about that possibility earlier this week. The president made that clear yesterday.
I read the same stories that I'm unhappy with this one or that one, and I'm not. I think the cabinet's done a great job. I read a story that I was unhappy with Pete because he was attacking drug dealers. I said, that's not exactly right. I would say very much the opposite. Pete Hegseth has been phenomenal. I read a story recently, I'm unhappy with Kristi. I'm so happy with it. I mean, we have a closed border. We have a border that's the best border in the history of our country. Why would I be unhappy? She's fantastic, actually.
And so, I guess that one is put to bed. Meanwhile, the president has announced his gold card. This would be a $1 million gold card, which is a Visa Fast Track for wealthy foreigners. Here's the president announcing this yesterday.
We've just launched the Trump Gold Card. It was about 30 minutes from now. The site goes up, and all funds go to the United States government. Could be a tremendous amount of money. It'll also be able to help people like this keep, as an example, just one example, there are a lot of examples, people just buying them. It's somewhat like a green card, but with big advantages over a green card.
Okay, so apparently Howard Lutnick believes that this will raise $100 billion to lower taxes or pay down the federal debt, according to Politico. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, said we were taking in the bottom quartile. We're going to stop doing that. We're going to take only extraordinary people at the very top instead of people trying to take jobs from Americans. So apparently it's similar to the green card model. The individual will pay global tax just as a U.S. citizen or permanent resident would. Individuals will be charged $1 million for the gold card, $2 million for corporations sponsoring an employee, in addition to a $15,000 vetting fee. There's also going to be a Trump Platinum card. All these, by the way, do have the president's face on them. But that one's not coming anytime soon. It would apparently cost $5 million and allow holders to spend up to 270 days in the United States without being taxed on their non-U.S. based income. So again, not a terrible idea. It'll be interesting to see how many people take the United States up on it. Better to have people paying $1 million to get the Trump Gold Card than to continue to import refugees from various areas of the world who are then wildly dependent on welfare. New report out of the Center for Immigration Studies, Breitbart, reports it. More than 8 in 10 households headed by Somali refugees in the state of Minnesota are on one or more forms of American taxpayer welfare. The data is based on 10 years of data from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, and it shows drastic disparities between native-born American households and Somali-born households in Minnesota, where nearly 80,000 residents have Somali ancestry compared to 0 who had Somali ancestry back in 1990. 81% of all Minnesota households headed by Somali refugees are on one or more forms of welfare, including 27% on cash welfare, 54% on food stamps, 73% who are on Medicaid. How about native-born Americans? 21% are on one or more forms of welfare. So, yeah, we may not be importing the people who are the greatest assets to the future of the country. Well, meanwhile, it is always amusing whenever there are Republicans who appear with Democrats to watch Republicans go out of their way to condemn bigotry on their own side. Very often this happens, not always, but very often. And to watch Democrats then completely ignore the bigotry on their own side. So there was a sit-down recently between Utah Governor Spencer Cox, who's a quite moderate Republican in Utah, and Josh Shapiro, the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro said that it's very important that all leaders must condemn all political violence. Very, very important. This is for NBC's Finding Common Ground series.
Let's be clear. Political violence has hit people on the left and the right. It's been engaged in by some people on the political left and the political right. Let's remember, when you pick up a gun and try and shoot someone, you are not sane and rational and a linear thinker, and so sometimes your views can be characterized on the political right or the political left. In just the last few months, you've seen Charlie Kirk, a conservative, and Speaker Hortman in Minnesota murdered. People on the left and right. In my home state, you've seen an assassination attempt on the President of the United States on the right, and myself and my family on the political left. We need to begin by saying that all leaders must condemn all political violence, not cherry pick which violence to condemn and which violence to accept.
So, again, all of that is well and good. The only problem, of course, is that Democrats then, when asked for specifics on who on their own side they will condemn, they can come up with no one. It's very easy to say, I condemn political violence on the political right, and I condemn it on the political left. But then when it comes time to name names, then all of a sudden everybody goes silent. No mention of Black Lives Matter. No mention of the political identity of Charlie Kirk's murderer, for example. It is a constant irritant to me when people will sort of say both sides are responsible for a thing, and then when it comes to their own side, they will go completely silent. Chuck Schumer did this yesterday. So Chuck Schumer was at a congressional menorah lighting ceremony in Washington, D.C. And again, as an Orthodox Jew, Chuck Schumer's continual attempts to call upon his ethnic Judaism in order to cover for his shameful behavior in office is of high irritation to me. He condemned anti-Semitism and Nazism and other forms of bigotry. He has yet to say a word in anger about any of the anti-Semitic nonsense in his own party, ranging from Zoran Mamdani in New York to Ilhan Omar. Here he was yesterday.
The evil forces of anti-Semitism, neo-Nazism, and other forms of hatred and bigotry are running rampant in our society. And too many, far too many, are silent against these threats. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, silence is dangerous. When we stay silent, that's when the poison of anti-Semitism spreads like wildfire. We have seen that throughout our history.
Okay, well, I mean, you did stay silent on your own side, and you remain silent on your own side. If you actually want to fight bigotry, you actually have to call it out on your own side. I know, difficult lessons for everybody to learn. Okay, meanwhile, the Warner Brothers deal continues to be a little bit up in the air. Netflix, of course, had issued a deal that was taken up by Warner Brothers, but the deal is still up in the air. According to The Verge, Netflix is still the frontrunner to become Warner Brothers' new owner, but the war for control of the legacy studio is not yet over. Paramount Skydance has now made its own outsized offer for the company. It would give CEO David Ellison even more control over the news and entertainment landscape. While Warner Brothers Discovery has repeatedly turned down Paramount Skydance's previous offers, Netflix's bid could also fall apart because it is subject to regulatory scrutiny by the FTC and the Department of Justice. Apparently, Warner Brothers has signaled it's open to the Netflix $82.7 billion acquisition proposal, which would include both straight cash and stock options, and would follow the split of Warner Brothers Discovery into two companies. Netflix would only acquire part of the company, would not acquire, for example, CNN. Paramount Skydance is trying to buy all of it for $108.4 billion in cash, like with no stock. That deal would give Paramount Skydance control of Warner Brothers movie and TV production studios, the HBO Max brands, and unlike Netflix's proposal, all of WBD's cable networks like Discovery Channel and TNT as well. So, really interesting to see how this is going to work out. So, apparently, there is talk that if Larry Ellison and David Ellison take over Warner Brothers, including CNN, that there will be changes made to CNN in the same way as changes were made by the Ellisons to CBS News, which, by the way, for the country would be great. CNN has been for a very long time a dying channel on the verge of collapse that is very left-oriented while claiming objectivity. Apparently, in recent days, David Ellison offered assurances to Trump administration officials that if he bought Warner, he would make sweeping changes to CNN. Now, again, we will have to see what legal boundaries are tied up here. It seems difficult for me to see how Paramount ends up pulling this out, given that Netflix has already been accepted by WBD. President Trump, for his part, of course, on a political level, would love to see Paramount acquire Warner Brothers. He said that he believes that any deal for Warner Brothers has to include CNN. Right now, of course, Netflix doesn't want to buy CNN because, frankly, who would unless you want to change it?
But I think CNN should be sold because I think the people that are running CNN right now are either corrupt or incompetent.
And that would be a factor in decision making because we've got some.
Well, in my mind, but I can be talked out of that by some very talented people that we have, antitrust people. But I just think that the people that have run CNN into the ground, by the way, nobody watches, very few people watch. I don't think they should be entrusted with running CNN any longer. So I think any deal should be guaranteed and certain that CNN is part of it.
Now, generally, I do not think that the government should be involved in these sorts of decisions, and that generally applies specifically here. Regardless of my personal feelings on which corporation would be better for the country in terms of acquiring Warner Brothers, and again, I'm a fan of what the Ellisons are doing, I do not think that the federal government should be using its regulatory leverage in order to make certain deals that it finds more politically palatable, because I don't like it when the shoe is on the other foot. With that said, Bernie Sanders ripped into Jared Kushner because Kushner is involved in that takeover bid of WB. He tweeted, "A handful of giant corporations already control much of the media. Trump wants to make it worse. He vows to be involved in allowing his billionaire allies, his son-in-law and the Saudis, Qataris, and Emirates to buy Warner Brothers. That's authoritarianism, not democracy." Well, it sort of depends on the outcome. But also, I noticed that Bernie Sanders is not particularly concerned about the other giant corporation that is trying to, take over Warner Brothers. So I guess certain giant corporations, according to Bernie, are better than other giant corporations. Alrighty, folks. Coming up, we are going to jump into that vaunted Ben Shapiro Show mailbag. Remember, in order to watch, you have to be a member. If you're not a member, become a member. Use code Shapiro at checkout for 2 months free on all annual plans. Click that link in the description and join us.